disagree with Ruth. Yes, we're in favour of local energy generation, but we've got to tackle the commanding heights of the economy. I mean, if we can mobilise people to force the renationalisation of public utilities, they're not going to sit back and allow it just to be run bureaucratically against their interests. It's about mobilising people, it's about process. So my key point here is, we're not oversimplifying climate change, we're not setting up a contradiction, a conflict between protecting biodiversity and tackling climate change. The things are connected, but they're also connected with the big political issues as well.
Thank you. I'd like to give Pat a chance to come back to you, because obviously you criticise on misinformation. So, would you like to say anything?
Very briefly, yeah, absolutely agree. Biodiversity is a huge issue, and I probably know the campaign is very strongly on biodiversity.
Sustainability was what I said, not necessarily
Okay,
biodiversity. I did mention that
Just
sustainability was really important.
Yeah, that's fine. Brian, friendly, I think actually very clearly about the triple bottom line in terms of sustainable, in terms of economic and social and environmental sustainability. And obviously, they're all a piece, which is, I think, one of the reasons that people are talking quite a lot about how the economic systems work, because that's a large part of how all of this fits together. And I think in itself that's a very important point. These things are all fitting together. On the oversimplification, yeah, I mean, I'm not in a position to go into the depths of climate science. I agree, yes, it has been changing. You know, all the things you say are correct. I don't necessarily say all of them every time I talk about energy. I'm an energy market expert. I also don't say everything about how the energy market works every time I talk about fuel poverty, because it's not the issue that we're discussing. So yes, we need to make sure our facts are right, but I don't think any of us were saying anything that was incorrect. It just wasn't all the detail, and I think you do have to simplify when you're talking about things in a wider sense. Something I wanted to say from the previous discussion about price freezes and things, I think for me the big problem at the moment in the short term is that energy has become a political football. And therefore, politicians are pushed into, or push themselves into, making snap announcements about various things. Cameron wants to cut the green crap. Major, obviously he's retired now, but Major wants to have a windfall tax, which actually would just come back to consumers, because that's how retailers work. If you tax them in a particular way, that will come straight back onto consumers' bills. And then the price freeze, which, you know, it may stop things getting any worse for a couple of years, but and will be quite a useful disruption to the market, but it's not going to solve the underlying problems. And I think really what we need first is for everyone to grow up a bit, or politicians to grow up a bit and stop sort of trying to get easy wins and really think hard about what we need to do to make a system work properly for people. And that may be through renationalisation, it may be through community energy, and personally I'm a little bit... Sorry?
All of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of them. I think there's lots of different models, and Germany has a lot of really interesting stuff going on. Also some big problems with their electricity grid, which can't cope with lots and lots of renewables, and that's a big problem. We want to avoid that. We need the grid to evolve and to innovate faster. So yeah, I think there's a lot of issues, particularly around the politics of energy at the moment, which are making everything really, really difficult.
To be honest with you, I know it's good to have debate and discussion and all of those kind of things, but I don't quite understand what your criticism is in terms of simplifying climate change. I mean, if what you're saying is that there is complexity within this area, then of course, who would debate otherwise? The weather patterns, the climate is altogether an extremely complex set of interrelationships. There is also simplicity in it as well. There are some simple processes at play. And what I was trying to reflect, and I think this is really important to reflect, because sadly, as people have already pointed out, it rarely comes across in the way that it needs to come across. The BBC hardly ever talk about this issue. When they do, they have this false balance with people who don't represent your community as a climate scientist. Nigel Lawson isn't a climate scientist, etc., etc. This false balance, they talk nonsense all the time. So there are some simple things that I think do need to come across. And what I was trying to reflect is that within the IPCC report that's just been published before Christmas, their concern is on a number of levels. One, things are happening much, much more quickly than they expected to. They expected the kind of reduction in Arctic sea ice that we've got at this moment to be somewhere mid this century. It's happened already. Secondly, their main argument is that if we stay on track for the rise in emissions, which we are currently doing at this moment in time, if nothing changes, then we are potentially on track for a 4-degree warming by the end of the century. And, okay, all right, but you know, let me make the point, because even if it is more, it doesn't undermine what I'm saying, it actually amplifies what I'm saying. And in those circumstances, the quote that I read out earlier is from James Hansen. It's not, as I said before, it's not to scare people, but in those circumstances, the question of adaptation is pretty meaningless for us as a species. In any kind of meaningful way, the kind of societies that we have become used to living in no longer exist, can no longer exist in the way that we've become used to living in those societies. And it's not true that humans have adapted to a changing climate in that way. That those kind of 4-degree, 5-degree, 6-degree warming, humans have never lived in those kind of climatic conditions on planet Earth. So it's not like we have some kind of precedence for adapting to a changing climate in that way. The key thing, therefore, is at the moment nothing is happening. When are we going to start acting on this issue? Because our window of opportunity is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. And they're simple things, simple, important messages I think lots of people are starting to wake up to, and lots of people are being increasingly the obstacle becomes not what people think in their heads, but what is actually happening, what politicians are doing, who's blocking it, etc., etc. And they're important, simple messages to get across.
Sharon.
Shara Ali, I'm from the Brent Green Party. I share some of the concerns about maybe attention waning, and I think it would be quite interesting to diagnose that. In my own sort of experience in this area, and obviously politics is wider than party politics, is that marches have denuded and the interest has waned, and that's unfortunate. But why has that happened? I mean, there are so many reasons potentially. One of them could be that people don't see the success of marching generally in political movements, or it could be that we're faced with a, if you will, like a diversification of media. So it's no longer the case, for example, somebody can get on the wireless and motivate everybody. Nobody's accessing the same media at the same time. So in a sense, people are coming to the issue at different times. And we may now be relying upon, say, the next generation through education to actually get a grip of the situation and take charge in the fullness of time, but we're running out of time. So that's one problem in terms of how do you diagnose, shall we say, the fact that we haven't actually capitalised on the knowledge that people have of the problem. I think the other thing is that, you know, we're all here, for example, and we're talking amongst a friendly audience, you know, with maybe some exceptions about, you know, how we're framing it. But the thing is that my worry is that we're not broadening our base of activists as such. We are talking to the same people as such. And how do we go beyond that? And to some extent, you know, different strokes for different folks. We need to try and find ways of tapping into those other communities. One suggestion, for example, is how to reach out to religious communities. There are lots of faith groups, there are interfaith models of how, within your religious text, for example, Islam, if you look at Islam, you can look at the Quran, you can look at the Sunnah, and you'll see there are some pieces of language, you know, to do with stewardship of the earth. And that's quite common in all monotheistic traditions, actually. There's the idea that perhaps the planet is a kind of a gift, and although human being Homo sapiens, I'm not saying that they should be at the top of the pecking order, but the fact is that they are given some responsibility over the earth in terms of biodiversity, species protection, and all the rest of it, and future generations. And there are quite a lot of scholars within religious traditions now who are trying to look at that and use that as a way of motivating religious folk. And I think we also need to be broadening our base, not just talking to people who are coming at this from a scientific objective standpoint or a humanistic tradition, but we need to find ways of reaching out to those people, speaking in a language that they can understand and relate to through their own multiple perspectives.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that we all recognise that the process is complex that some of it is really quite difficult to understand, and it is only when, for instance, with the floods, people are able to relate it to the fact of the shrinking of the Arctic ice and the change of the flow of the jet stream and so on, that we're able to say, oh yes, so that's how that bit of it works. And climate science is quite obviously developing all the time. Science isn't something that stands still. Science is a process of learning and understanding. But we're not being helped by the politicians or the media, because what they're doing is straightforwardly lying to us. I mean, I heard that Nigel Lawson thing, and it was absolutely appalling. The people who are oversimplifying are the climate deniers. Oh, it's not about global warming, or as Suzanne was quoting, yes, it would be nice, you know, we'll be able to grow grapes in Harleston, or won't it be lovely to have a bit of global warming? We can put the sun loungers out. Those are the people who are oversimplifying, and they are being given massive amounts of airtime and space in the newspapers and so on. And it's when something happens like the floods that the hypocrisy of it all is exposed. First you get the, we are a rich nation, money is no object. So why are people queuing up on the picket, the braziers on a picket line thinking that it's a soup kitchen? It is, we are a rich, sorry, not we are, this is a rich nation. That is, it is a nation in which 10% or something of people are insanely rich. And then you get, with the attention that's paid to the floods, it isn't, as somebody beautifully put it, until the effluent reaches the affluent, but they actually start to take notice. It's when the plain fields of Eton are underwater, then you get this government moving. Now, we've got a job to do, because those proposals about putting solar tiles on every new building, and all the other things that can be done, making sure, absolutely right, brilliant, sensible, straightforward, simple, not over. So what has happened? There's been a bonfire of regulations, among them planning regulations, regulations about sustainability of new buildings. Everything that they touch, they are actually making the situation worse. And without oversimplifying, every small step that we take to expose the hypocrisy, to show what it's like, is more likely to bring about that bigger movement that forces them to renationalise the energy companies. And that's a fantastically popular demand that forces them into building sustainably, that makes them see, that forces them to take the massive subsidy again away from nuclear and put it into renewables. You know, it's not a question of making profits. It's well, it is for them, and that is all they care about in the short term. They're exactly like those people in the hedge funds who were gambling on the bubble because they thought they could get there. They knew it was going to burst. They wanted their profits. Well, it did. That lot know the planet's hurtling towards hell, but they just want to grab their profits.
Thank you very much. I've got two more people.
Actually, one thing that really hasn't been talked about a lot, and you kind of touched on it just at the end there, is actually monetary policy. Because zero interest rates and the quantitative easing is really at the central issue. Because people don't realise this, but after 2008, all the big banks, what they did was use all that money that they got and actually then started to buy up lots of future contracts and started to really ram up all the food prices, all the commodity food prices, all the energy prices, and they were profiteering, they were making supernormal profits of that. That money, they bought up, Goldman Sachs, all of them, they actually bought up big super tankers, and what they then do now is actually, if the price isn't quite right, they'll hold back supplies so that everyone at the pump and everyone paying their energy bills that's at the heart of all of the problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. We have global warming, we have climate change and environmental crisis. But it is not just an environmental crisis, it's actually unique because at the same time we have an economic crisis. And we have been into a crisis, a global crisis, since 2007. And the two are not unrelated. And it's not a coincidence that one and the other are happening at the same time. Because as capitalism develops, so the environment gets worse, and as you have global warming and climate change, that affects cost of production, pressure on profit, and the result is then required to take even further measures, spend more money, resources into extracting more out of the ground and so on and so forth, and that creates climate change itself, and that has react on the economy and so on and so forth. So we have this vicious circle, whereby if you have an economic crisis like we do, of course then nothing is going to happen, no measure is going to be taken to improve the environment because we can't afford it. Environment gets worse, the economy will get worse as well, and so on and so forth. And this is what is going to happen in the future. If there is no particular end, although we're supposed to be, the economy is supposed to be growing and so on, in fact, this austerity and this economic crisis are going to carry on and on and on. And the deniers, it isn't that they are fools or they're stupid. Some of them are professors, you know, who go back, a few of them, who go back to, worked during the Cold War into anti-communism and so on and so forth. And they're the ones who are most prevalent in terms of climate change deniers. And the reason behind it isn't just they're fools, is because these people actually realize that if you're going to take any action to stop global warming, then you have to basically get rid of capitalism. And just as they said before, better dead than red, so they say now, better no planet than no capitalism. It's very small step from one to the other. So that's the reason behind it. It isn't that they know precisely what's actually going on. Now, sometime or another, and I don't disagree with anything that's been said and so on. Everything is people do marvelous things and so on. But sometime or another, we'll have to make a break. Somebody will have to be brave enough to say, we're going to default on our national debt. We are not going to pay the national debt or the interest on it. A break has to be taken. You have to take a break because this is a crisis that's not going to end. It may get slightly better, slightly worse, but it's going to be worse. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. And somebody will have to say, we'll have to take a break out of it, and say, well, we are no longer going to play that game. Okay. We'll default.
Thank you very much. We've got about 4 minutes left. I know Ruth wants to come back, and you, Maureen, as well.
Yeah, it's practical things, really. First of all, things can change very fast. Look at Occupy. It came up. We didn't get that far, but it showed how much can change in a very short time in terms of what people are ready to do. One thing on the nationalisation, I think one focus has to be British Gas, and we are actually planning an action this year at the British Gas AGM in May, and we hope that people will join us. I know a lot of people were thinking of targeting it and then kind of dropped away, but Fuel Poverty Action is actually going to pull it together. So we hope that you'll be there, and you can make the points about renationalisation or taking it into local community hands. I don't think those are contradictory, and I think British Gas, since it used to be a national asset, is an ideal place to do that. Also, in terms of being out on the streets, I think that, we hear again and again about the BBC. The BBC very obviously have a fixed policy to discredit climate change science and to make sure that nobody wants to take action about it. Why can't we picket them? Or why can't we go into, invade their offices? And I think anybody who organised that would have a lot of people coming along, because we're sick of just throwing things at our own televisions, and we'd like to throw things at somebody else instead. Can I say just one other thing? This meter campaign, one of the ways that movements grow, and we saw it with the poll tax, is by people helping themselves and refusing to pay things that they cannot afford to pay. And we can do it with fuel poverty. And the one where we're starting is with the meters. The companies are actually breaking in, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally, breaking into people's homes to put in these prepayment meters that mean people end up cutting themselves off. And we're going to be stopping that, and we hope that you'll help us with it.
Thank you. Okay, Murray.
Thank you. There are so many points. I'll just pick and choose the ones that I think I can deal with.
Yeah.
The oversimplification, I'll sign up. I'm guilty as anyone else on that front. I just find, though, if you use certain language, it goes over the top of other people's heads. I'm familiar with the global warming language, but I'll give you an example. If you go to West London, where communities are against the expansion of Heathrow, if you start talking to them about carbon emissions, straight over their heads. But if you talk to them about aircraft noise, then they understand how it affects them. And I think sometimes you've got to get the right medium and the right language, and sometimes you have to make compromises. So I'm not saying CO2 emissions isn't an issue with aviation, but you've got to really picture where people are with the issue on their doorstep. And I think that's the way you push environmental issues. I think this opportunity with floods gives us a very good case. It's the first time, I think, for a long time we've had this discourse in the public arena, and I think it will be very useful. So, for example, in the context of floods, we're discussing market versus state intervention. In terms of markets, we're told home insurance can help you out and what have you, but that's after the event, for God's sake. People would rather have the state intervention to make sure it doesn't happen in the first place. We're preventing things rather than giving people relief. And I think the Prime Minister's got to understand that more clearly. And as for alternatives, we've talked about austerity. It's actually financial austerity, fiscal austerity, not monetary austerity, as the gentleman mentioned about the expansion of quantity, the monetary expansion through quantitative easing. But there are alternatives, and I think actually the 1 million climate jobs was a credible alternative, which shows that if you change your priorities and emphasis in society, you can make a difference. And for example, all the installation stuff we talked about earlier is a low-lying fruit. It's not rocket science, it's actually pretty straightforward. So I've got more faith in things like this. And that also explains my response to religion. I personally think the Abrahamic faiths are very materialistically based. If there is one faith which I think is less materialistically based, I think it's Hinduism. But that's my own interpretation of the global faiths. And I wouldn't want to expand on that, but given it was raised, I think it's something which I don't see the solution there, is what I'm saying. And I think this is more convincing to me, 1 million jobs. And finally, I think as Brent residents, so you're all Brent residents here, presumably? I think you should be grateful that you're living in a fracking-free zone. But when he came up with that, I was cacking when I heard that, because this is the borough that used to be a nuclear-free zone because of the nuclear waste going free, and long may that continue.
Okay. Yes. Gosh, I'm getting nudged from over here. So, there is a list of attenders going around. If you could make sure you sign, if you want to be kept informed, and also let me know who's been here to contact you if necessary. Thank you very much for coming. But before I do that, this man who's been nagging me tonight, I just want to pay a tribute to him.
Yeah.
He is leaving Brent. He's moving to Brighton. He's been trying to organise this meeting at the same time as buying a couple of houses and moving and so on. Ken is the secretary of Brent Campaign Against Climate Change. We are sorry to lose him, but we won't actually lose touch entirely because he's still active nationally, and I'll be getting his emails and so on. But can we give him a round of applause, and also to our panel? Thank you all very much for coming.